I'm Rip Esselstyn, and you're listening to the Plant Strong podcast. If you're the kind of person who loves going deep into the latest research and trends in the health and fitness space, I know you're going to love this conversation with Dr. Matthew Nagra, a plant-based naturopathic doctor from Vancouver, Canada. Today, we're going to cut through the noise and the so-called expert advice on all the latest topics like organic foods, plant-based meats, salt substitutes, eggs, protein, and yes, Matt's thoughts on oil. We're going to have this informal axe it or stack it right after these words from Plant Strong. Hey, podcast listeners. I've got something special just for you. For a limited time, you can grab a 2-pack of our organic skillet burger mixes for just $10. That's right. You can make alarmingly amazing plant-based burgers at home for just $1.25 a serving. Each pack makes up to 4 hearty protein and fiber-packed burgers, so you're getting 8 delicious burgers at an unbeatable price. You can choose from black bean, portobello, or sweet curry. I believe that these are the best plant-based burgers on the market, and I want you to taste the difference. Just use the code PODCAST, PODCAST, at checkout and save $6.99 off the 2-pack. But hurry, this deal is going to disappear after January 30th. Just go to plantstrong.com to grab your exclusive podcast deal. Have you heard the great news? If you love research and taking a deep dive into the emerging science, you do not want to miss this exclusive opportunity because Dr. Dawn Musalem of the famed Mayo Clinic, renowned expert in cancer treatment and prevention and all things related to health and plant-based living, will be joining us April 6th to the 11th at our Sedona retreat to share her wisdom, her caring expertise, and her endless energy for everyone. Come hear her personal story, get answers to your questions, and just try to keep up with the passionate, plant-powered Dr. Musalem. I cannot wait. Simply visit liveplantstrong.com and then click on events to learn more. I hope to see you in Sedona in April. Follow Dr. Matt Nagra on Instagram, and you'll get a glimpse into his philosophies and entertaining insights on many of the latest topics in the world of nutrition. Dr. Nagra himself is a plant-based naturopathic doc who specializes in nutrition, so it's little wonder that he stays on top of the research so he can apply it with his patients to address their various health concerns. Well, today, I threw the book at Dr. Nagra and asked his thoughts on many hot topics. It's almost like an axe it or stack it episode I did with David Goldman a few weeks ago, as Matt shares research on things like eggs, meat substitutes, gluten, protein, and, of course, oil. Now, we may not necessarily see eye to eye on every topic, but you know what we do agree on? Cutting through the BS and the confusion and providing evidence-based research that shows a whole food, plant-based diet can prevent and treat chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes, as well as optimize longevity and performance. And that gets a big kale yeah from the both of us. Please welcome Dr. Matthew Nagra. All right, Dr. Matthew Nagra, welcome to the Plant Strong podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Matt, where are you right now? Are you in Canada?
Yeah, Vancouver, Canada.
Got it. Are you a Canadian citizen?
Yeah, I was actually born and raised on Vancouver Island. I don't know if you've ever been, but spent most of my life there and then moved over to the mainland into Vancouver
Uh-huh.
about, I want to say 6-7 years ago now.
Oh yeah, no, I've been to Vancouver Island. It's a little slice of heaven.
Absolutely. We have a little bit of everything there, and it's becoming quite the sort of retirement destination now as well.
Yeah,
So a lot of nice properties on the water and everything.
right. I'm sure it's not cheap either.
Yeah, just depends where you are. If you're on the water, yeah, it's definitely not cheap.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we took an Alaskan cruise this last spring, and we ended up in Vancouver. And you talk about a beautiful city. God, Vancouver. You got you've got the you got the ocean, and they've also got the mountains. It's quite the kind of combination.
Yeah, yeah. If you don't mind the cold water, you can probably go skiing and go for a swim in the same day if you really
Yeah,
wanted to.
yeah. Um, so let's jump right in because you have done a kind of a remarkable job on your Instagram channel, sharing with people a lot of the studies, the research. I can't even imagine how much time you spend reading journals and surfing the net. Can you give me an approximation how much time you spend a week doing that?
I would say pretty much every day when I first wake up and I'll have a tea or coffee, I'll look up basically what's new that day. So I have all these PubMed searches all preset. So every morning I have my beverages, I have my foods, my nutrients, my plant-based searches, and I'll filter them all and kind of scroll through what seems interesting that day. And I'll either read them if I have time, or I'll save them for later that day. But I do that almost every single day, so
Wow.
it's quite a lot. Yeah.
So is there anybody that you kind of nerd out over this stuff with?
Oh yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm in plenty of sort of group chats that we can nerd out. But people like Simon Hill, he and I talk almost daily, and I know you're
Wow.
familiar with him. Nutrition Made Simple. He has a really good Dr. Gil Carvalho. He has a really good YouTube channel that actually your dad was just on for an interview.
Hmm.
So I talk with him pretty regularly, and we chat about the nitty gritty details of some of these studies, and so I feel like there's quite a few people like that.
What you know who is in my circle and seems to be really starting to embrace the research and the studies is Adam Sudd, who I
Oh
think
yeah, he and I talk all the time. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. Now when and why did you decide to go into medicine?
So I'm actually, to clarify, I'm a naturopathic doctor. So we can get into a little bit about maybe those details in a minute. But when I was going into my undergraduate studies, I definitely thought about going into healthcare. But I also started to get really interested in nutrition. So just in my last couple of years of high school, I started changing my diet. Actually shifted towards a more of a plant-based diet, and I saw improvements in athletic performance. Weight loss, my skin was clearing up, my asthma seemed to be getting better. And whether it's a coincidence or related to the diet, I'm sure there's a bit of both. I thought, well, maybe nutrition plays a role in our health. Something, as I'd say, as a teenager, a lot of people don't really think about too much. And so once I got into university and I started taking my nutrition even more seriously, I thought, well, how can I meld the two? Like, how can I focus on nutrition with my patients, but also embrace medicine, as it has a lot of utility. There is a lot of importance in that realm. I know there's a lot of people that are like anti-medicine or one or the other. Like, no, we can do both. And it was actually one of my instructors in undergrad who recommended I speak with and shadow a couple of her naturopathic doctors. And I thought, or I learned about how broad their scope is. So here in BC, we can prescribe, we can send for blood testing, we can do a lot of nutrition counseling. It's actually a very broad scope. And obviously that's going to be different between different provinces or states. But here in BC, it is sort of the best of both worlds in a way, if you choose to practice in that way. And so it was around my second, third year of undergrad that I decided that this is the route I wanted to go. And I do focus a lot on nutrition now, while obviously incorporating those parts of medicine as much as needed, or as much as I can.
Where did you go to undergraduate?
The University of Victoria on Vancouver Island, as we were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very, very nice. And so you mentioned, you went plant-based and your skin cleared up and you saw some other benefits, but can you remember who it was in your life that suggested or inspired you to kind of lean into the plants?
Yeah, I've told this story many times, but it was funny enough, my personal trainer at the time. So I think it was grade 11 or maybe the summer between grades 10 and 11, I was working with a personal trainer as I was gearing up for football. I also played a lot of soccer, did some martial arts. So I was quite active, and he was really pushing more of a plant-based approach. Now, he wasn't exclusively plant-based, but we'll say, 90, maybe 95% or somewhere in that realm. And he recommended it. And it was actually him and his wife, who was also a trainer, telling me to record everything I ate for a couple of weeks, to do a food diary. And at the time, I was like, oh man, they're going to see how terrible my diet is. It's going to be so bad. The workouts already suck. And how much worse are they going to make it once they see this? And so I actually cleaned up a lot of my diet in many ways for that period. I was like, I'm just going to, really show them how healthy I can eat. And again, I was maybe 15 at the time, but I ended up cutting out dairy at that point. I reduced my meat intake. I got rid of a lot of these sort of classic, ultra processed foods, things like sugary beverages, potato chips, and so on. And that made a world of difference, along with having more smoothies like fruits and veggies and things like that. But it made a big difference, especially when it came to weight management, which is something I struggled with growing up quite a bit, even though I played all those sports. So that was really what triggered those changes.
You mentioned it was your trainer that kind of set you off in this direction, which I absolutely love, because here in the United States, I mean, I can't even imagine a personal trainer suggesting to their client, hey, you should consider plants. It is so much more slanted, I think, towards paleo, keto, carnivore. It's just, it's sinful. And I think that's a testament to the fact that I think Canada is way, way ahead of the United States when it comes to eating healthy. The plate or the nutritional guidelines that the government has laid out for Canadians by and large. And I just find that Canadians, and some of my best friends are Canadians, have a much more kind of down to earth humility and also open mind to these things. Does that make sense? Would you agree?
Yeah. I think if you compare to America, that I would agree. I don't think it's quite. I don't think it's as big of a shift as some people might garner from what you're saying. I think there's still a lot of very pro-meat, animal-based sort of proponents here. I think I just got really lucky, to be honest, with my trainer. I think, at that age, 15-year-old guy wanting to be fit, I think if my trainer started recommending the keto diet or carnivore or something, I might have bought into it. Like, who knows at the time. And I feel very fortunate that it shifted me in this direction instead.
Yeah. So how many years ago was that?
So that was about 16 years ago. And then I went 100% plant-based in my first year of university. So it's been almost 14 years.
Any pushback from family and friends?
My family was actually very supportive early on, but they also knew that trainer very well. They trusted his, recommendations. My dad worked with him as well. So I feel like that helped me a bit, but it was more so when you get to like the grandparents or the extended family, and like that's where there's more pushback. And of course, especially when it comes to grandparents growing up, they, their whole lives for several decades at that point, they've been consuming a lot of these things. And I think it makes it a lot harder to sort of see that shift. But now my grandparents are eating much more plant-based, and when we're there, they'll make us plant-based meals and things. They'll substitute the milk for soy milk and those. So I feel like it's had sort of a ripple effect.
Nice. Do you refer to yourself as vegan, plant-based, plant leaning, plant strong? What's your, terminology for what you call yourself?
Yeah, so I call myself a vegan. I would say in the year following that transition is when I started to become more interested in sort of the ethical side and those reasons to eat this way. And I would say really that's what keeps me 100% plant-based. Like, can you really make a health argument for 95% versus 100%? Not really, but it's the ethical argument that keeps me at 100%. And so absolutely, I do consider myself vegan, but the initial reason for that switch was more so on the health side.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny for me. All, obviously the ethical, the environmental, all those things have come into play the longer that I've done it. But when I first started it, it was just easier for me. It was just very black and white when I knew, okay, I'm eating plants and I'm not doing animals or animal byproducts, as opposed to, oh, I'm 98% or 95%. It's like my attitude was, I'm going to do this. I want to do it 100%. And that was even before, this was back in 1987,
Yeah.
right? But before, the environment was a thing, and nobody had thrown the ethical stuff at me. I just was like, all right, I'm in 100%. I'm not going 98. I'm not going 96. I'm going in. So, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's very similar to my own case when I first decided to jump in 100%. I think for me, it was much easier to draw that line because if I, quote unquote, allow myself to have X amount of, animal products or other things, then that becomes 2% to 5% to
Right.
10%. It is a slippery slope for me. I'm not saying it's that way for everybody, right? So different people might be able to manage that better, but for me, that was certainly the case.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you and I both know other human beings.
Yeah.
And I think for the vast majority, it is a slippery slope. I think it's the individual that can do actually one piece of, one egg a week, or,
Mm.
half a thing of fish every 2 weeks. They're few and far between. I really honestly believe that, having done this and work with people now for a long, long time. Let me ask you, I'm going to start firing some questions
Yeah,
your
let's do
way,
it.
Matt. And I know this is something that you love to do. So how do you respond when people come to you and they ask if a vegan or a plant-based diet, you're going to be deficient in very, very important nutrients? How do you respond to that?
So my first question is always which nutrients, and if these are people commenting on my Instagram page, I'd be like, link the reference. I want to see the sources because a lot of people just inherently believe these things, but have never actually really looked. The fact of the matter is, with every dietary pattern, whether it's vegan or vegetarian, or I know I'm calling vegan a dietary pattern. I know it's ethical, but for sake of this argument, I'm going to call it a dietary pattern. But vegan, vegetarian, omnivorous, there are pros and cons as far as nutrients. There are certain nutrients that are a lot easier to get on a vegan diet, like fiber, folate, magnesium. And then there are certain things on a more animal-based or omnivorous diet that are easier to get, like obviously protein intake tends to be higher, zinc perhaps could be higher. But then on the omnivorous side, you're typically lacking in things like folate, and things like fiber. And so you just shift that focus. So the first thing I like to settle is that, yes, there are certain things you need to focus on, but that's true of all diets. Once that's gone, then we look at, well, what do you have to worry about as a vegan? Well, okay, B12, take a B12 pill. Pretty easy. Or consume fortified foods regularly. Vitamin D, possibly, depending on where you're located, but that also, and how much sun you get, but that also applies to pretty much every other diet. Or take a simple multivitamin that just covers your bases really well as a safety net. There are a lot of different ways to manage those, but I would always want to know, like, well, what nutrients are you particularly concerned with? And we can address those individually, whether it's through foods or through supplementation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the one that's first and foremost with most people always is protein. I don't want to talk about that yet with you, though. Want to jump into that a little bit later.
Okay.
So, there's these personalities that are out there. The Dr. Gundry with Plant Paradox. You got Paul Saladino, and they go on these rants, making people think that plants are somehow toxic. can you help clarify that plants are in fact not toxic?
Yeah. There's a few things. I mean, the really quick kind of quippy response is, well, if they're toxic, they're doing a really bad job of killing us. But
Yeah.
like that's the first thing. And also, nobody eats them. Like if you actually look at fruit and vegetable consumption in, say, Americans, even like, kids, adults, medical professionals, they're typically falling below recommendations quite substantially. So that's the first thing that's really funny. But as far as this sort of toxicity argument, what is typically pointed to, especially for Gundry, are these lectins. So these are these compounds found in many plant foods. There's actually certain types of lectins in animal foods as well, but the ones that they typically complain about are the types in like kidney beans, for example. But what they always ignore is that when you cook these foods, those lectins are degraded down to points that they're almost non-detectable, sometimes non-detectable, depending on the type of cooking method. And at that point, there certainly aren't enough there to cause any harm. So we cook beans, we cook grains, that's pretty standard practice, I would say. And there are other types of lectins in things like tomatoes that aren't toxic, don't seem to have those types of harmful properties. And at least some preclinical data suggests they might have anti-cancer properties and whatnot. Not going to say that tomatoes are going to cure cancer or anything like that, but we could speculate about possible benefits from those types of lectins. But what it all comes back to, and this is like the most important takeaway, I think, when it comes to nutrition, is we have to look at the end result. What is the final outcome? And when you consider people who eat more beans versus those who eat less, they have lower risks of cardiovascular disease, lower risks of total mortality. That is the net result of consuming that food. So clearly it's overall beneficial. Even if we were to grant that you're consuming some lectins and those lectins are somewhat harmful, all of the benefits are overcompensating for that potential negative effect, leading to a net positive result.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is their angle? Why do you think they're trying to scream up and down that plants are toxic when, as you said, and I think the United States Economic Council would agree, most Americans aren't eating many whole plant-based foods whatsoever. So is it just to get attention? Is it something they're trying to sell? What do you think is going on there?
I think it's different. Now, I'm totally speculating. I don't know what's going on in these people's heads, but I think it's different for different people. So for some of them, I do kind of suspect that they know they're full of it and they're just promoting this and they're making a lot of money off it, gaining a lot of followers. It's very provocative sort of messaging.
Mm-hmm.
That's possible. For others, they might like truly believe it. They might have found this answer to all of our health concerns, or they might think that they found this answer to all of our health concerns and are trying to promote that message. And in some ways, that's possibly even more dangerous. But a lot of that is typically based on sort of, again, these individual mechanisms, kind of highlighting these potential things that could be going on, and so, assuming that it leads to that final result. And then they might do some patient counseling and have people adopt their recommendations, and they improve in some way, and they use that as evidence. The problem is with these anecdotes is you can make so many different changes and lead to short-term benefits. You can go carnivore and lose weight and possibly improve some blood biomarkers in the short term, but that doesn't mean it's good for you long term. You could start smoking and lose weight. It doesn't mean it's good for you long term. Like we can draw these parallels to things that we know are obviously bad for you long term, but they don't seem to apply that to things like dietary changes, like going carnivore or removing lectin-containing plants or whatever. So what is driving this? I don't know exactly, but I think those are a few possible explanations.
Yeah. You just mentioned the carnivore diet, which really, I think came out of nowhere maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. It just seems to be another iteration of, the Atkins, paleo, keto. What is your unbridled opinion of the carnivore diet?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is absolutely going to be quite dangerous long term. When we look at people posting their blood work, for example, I mean, their lipids are through the roof. We have some people, even leaders of the carnivore movement, like Sean Baker, whose hemoglobin A1C, it puts them in a pre-diabetes range, even though they don't eat carbohydrates. I've seen others with similar blood work. Sean Baker's testosterone was super low. Paul Saladino mentioned that his testosterone was dropping, and which is why he started incorporating plants, funny enough, even though he was known as the carnivore MD for years. These are all, again, anecdotal. We don't have good long-term evidence, but we're seeing harms, at least in those individuals who previously touted benefits based on their own experience. So like down the road, it ends up not being so good. But what we can do is we can look at the data we have on other food groups and sort of draw conclusions about what would happen. So we know that red meat consumption, when you're consuming it at a level of, say, a serving a day or more, is associated with a higher risk of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, colorectal cancer, and they're eating several servings a day. Do they just assume that the risk goes like this and then drops off once you hit high levels? Like, it doesn't make any sense. They're also removing foods that are associated with reductions in risk, things like fruits, veggies, whole grains, legumes. So it's like a double whammy. You're removing all of these really healthy foods and you're just maximizing consumption of these foods that may increase risk. How on earth can you expect that to lead to good outcomes? Like, the sort of mental gymnastics that are done to try to justify that is unbelievable. And I've, of course, engaged in these kind of debates. I've seen the types of arguments out there, and they're just nonsensical, really.
What exactly is the carnivore diet? What do you eat if you're on the carnivore diet?
If you ask different people, they might give you slightly different answers, but generally speaking, it's a diet comprised largely of meat, dairy, eggs, and they'll typically recommend including some like organ meats, things like liver and whatnot. But that's really it. And some of them will say you can add salt. A lot of them take electrolyte supplements, which I don't understand how that fits into this ancestral narrative. But they'll definitely add salt as a seasoning. But as far as I know, they won't really add herbs and things because those are plants, and you don't want those. So that's the basis for it. It's really not that complicated.
Mm-hmm. There's a personality who actually, I think he just moved here to Austin, Peter Attia, who's been getting a lot of attention as of late. And yeah, I know you have a Instagram post where he basically says that red meat doesn't cause cancer. I just saw a T-shirt not too long ago. It says beef. It's what's rotting in your colon. How do you think a Stanford educated, very obviously bright individual can, with a straight face, say that red meat doesn't promote or cause cancer?
Yeah, I think the waters have been sufficiently muddied around a lot of the red meat literature. There's certainly some industry influence in some of the messaging. There's certainly people with biases, and I would say, just to put this out there, everybody has a bias. Everybody eats. Everybody enjoys eating certain things more than others, whether it's ethically motivated, like with a vegan, or not. And so I will admit that as a vegan, I have some kind of bias, but when I evaluate the literature, I understand that and try to set that aside and see, like, how can I look at this objectively? There are people like Peter, like Lane Norton, etc., who I don't think can see their own biases. I think they believe that because they eat an omnivorous diet, plants and animals, that they don't have a bias. And that's just not true. Your bias could be for that omnivorous diet. So that's one. Second, I think he really, he holds a double standard with different types of evidence. And this is one of the things I pointed out in my post. So for example, he will say the research on exercise is phenomenal. He'll cite like massive reductions in cardiovascular disease risk, for example. But that's based on observational research. This research where you follow people over time, see those who exercise more versus those who exercise less, and how much of a reduction in risk they have. Of course, while doing your best to account for other variables like smoking, alcohol, etc. We have the same kind of research on red meat consumption, yet he discounts it because apparently you can't consider all those variables properly and whatnot, when it's literally the same thing with the exercise research. Like, why is it that you can hold the exercise literature in such high regard and then say that the red meat literature is just garbage? It doesn't make sense. There has to be some kind of double standard there. And I think that's really just his bias at play. And so, yes, even though he's Stanford educated and all of that, he's not free of bias. Nobody is. And you just have to understand that and be able to put that aside. Like me as a vegan, I can say, hey, some fish can be a part of a healthy diet, some low-fat dairy can be a part of a healthy diet. I don't think it's ethically, responsible to consume those foods. I think there are other issues with it environmentally as well. But I can say that and then still recommend a plant-based diet for all of those reasons. And I would like to see similar sort of messaging from people who are sort of on the other side, but we just don't see that a lot.
Yeah, good point. Really, really good point there. Speaking of meat, you know that there's a lot of vegan meat alternatives, substitutes that are out there. I think that you've done a pretty good deep dive into whatever literature exists around meat alternatives versus the real meat. Is there a definitive answer as far as which is healthier?
Yeah, so I actually don't know if you're aware or who is, but I actually published a paper in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology this summer on that topic. It's called Animal versus Plant-Based Meat, a Hearty Debate.
Wow.
And we focused on heart health specifically. So it was really exciting. It got a ton of media attention, like Men's Health, everything. It was awesome. And so, yes, I've done a deep dive into this topic. And basically, there are two things we looked at. One is the nutritional composition. So especially things like fiber, saturated fat, trying to understand how the nutrient profiles are with regard to like cardiovascular health and looking at those important ones. And then we looked at the studies actually giving people either plant-based or animal-based meats and seeing how their blood tests fare, essentially. And so on the first part, when we reviewed the literature, we looked at 14 studies done in different markets around the world. So all over Europe, South America, North America. I think there might have been one in Australia. And we found very consistently that plant-based meats had less saturated fat, more fiber, unsurprisingly, because animals don't contain fiber, less cholesterol. Again, animal foods are the only ones with cholesterol. And then we saw, at least in the limited studies that looked at this, less monounsaturated fats and more polyunsaturated fats, which are more of the heart healthy ones. So just on the basis of less saturated fat, more fiber, less cholesterol, like that's enough to suggest that the plant-based meat alternatives have a more heart healthy nutritional profile overall. Again, this is compared to meat. I'm not comparing it to like a black bean burger per se, which is a sort of separate comparison that we'd have to do. But that's positive. Then we looked at the trials where they give people one or the other, and very consistently, we saw lower total and LDL cholesterol levels with the plant-based meats, even when they used plant-based meats with coconut oil, which are higher in saturated fat. So even in those cases, it tended to improve LDL cholesterol compared to the meat. And then there were some studies that suggested a little bit of a reduction in waist circumference, in body weight, and there were no significant differences in blood pressure, even though a lot of the plant-based meats have a lot of salt. So that was really interesting. And one of the possible explanations is that these plant-based meats, they come pre-seasoned, so they already have salt added. Whereas when you cook up a burger, a typical burger, you're adding salt to it. So the salt intake ends up being about the same. That's one of the most easy sort of explanations for what's going on. But there could also be benefits of the little bit of fiber lowering blood pressure. It could be things like some of the phytonutrients lowering blood pressure and compensating. But really the take home is the plant-based meats on average have a healthier nutritional profile, even though there's obviously variability. Some products will be better than others. And then compared to meat, the plant-based meats tend to improve cardiovascular risk factors. The next thing we need is long-term studies looking at, do they ultimately reduce risk of heart attack compared to animal-based meats? And I suspect we'll get that in the next couple of years or so, hopefully, as there are some studies that have tracked intake of those products over time, but they just haven't published them yet.
Yeah. When was the last time that you had some sort of a meat alternative?
Trying to think. I have them when I eat out every now and then. I did try. I was in the US. When was that? I want to say maybe a few weeks ago, a month ago, and I had the new Beyond there with the avocado oil. So it was quite good. And they lowered. That's one thing about these plant-based meats is you can reformulate them.
Mm-hmm.
You can't reformulate a cow, overnight very easily.
Yeah.
But you can reformulate these products. So they lowered the sodium, they lowered the saturated fat down to 2 grams. Like it's actually a pretty solid product. Mm-hmm. And I tried it and I thought it tasted really good. So that was That's the last time that rings a bell as far as trying it. But I mean, I may have eaten out once or twice since and had some. I can't remember.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, I know that whenever I have a Beyond Meat burger, I'm like, geez, it's really, I mean, it's good, right? I'm like, this is really good. But I mean, I probably haven't had one in 6 months. But probably 2 weeks ago, I was at a friend's house and I had a field roast sausage, and it was just too much. The sodium, I was like, I took like 2 or 3 little bites of it, and then I was like, I just can't continue. The sodium is just killing me here. And I think, one of the things that happens is as our palates become a little bit more sophisticated to the nuances of, salt and fat and other things, it becomes harder to eat, even though they're for most people, they're probably absolutely drop dead delicious. I think a little bit harder for some of us to eat.
Yeah, I think particularly the sodium is an issue like that for some people, where if you don't really add salt to your food and you're not used to that, and then like field roast in particular is quite high in sodium. I think it's like 500-600 milligrams per sausage. Whereas like to give you reference, the new Beyond burgers are like 300. It's like half of that per whole patty. So, but yeah, when you have those higher salt products, sometimes it can be a little overpowering if you aren't used to having salt like that. But as we know, most people are used to having a lot of salt, so it might suit them a lot better.
Yeah. So when you did your study, can you remember like how many different meat alternative brands, products were you guys looking at in totality?
Oh man, it's a lot. I couldn't give you a number. It was probably over 100. I think basically we didn't look at the individual brands, but we looked at studies done in these different areas of the world where they would actually look at what's available commercially, and they would, so obviously a number of different products in each area, and they would look at the nutritional profiles and compare them to the meat that they're designed to mimic. So it would have been a ton overall. I just can't give you an exact sort of number.
Yeah. So we were just talking about salt. Talk to me about salt substitutes. Are there any that you're a fan of that do the trick for people?
Yeah, so I actually think from a public health perspective, I think salt alternatives are one of the most powerful tools we have for lowering blood pressure. And there was a project, sort of a public health intervention done in Finland called the North Karelia Project, where they, on a massive scale, they lowered the saturated fat content of foods. They replaced a lot of the salt with these salt alternatives based on potassium or magnesium, and they significantly brought blood pressure down. They brought cholesterol levels down, and they lowered coronary heart disease risk rates in men by like 80%. Like unbelievable public health intervention, probably the best ever done. And and since then, we've had a lot of trials where you'll take people with high blood pressure, replace salt, at least for half of them, with these salt alternatives, and follow them for a number of years. And you see reductions in blood pressure, in ultimately stroke risk, which is what we're most concerned about. And so they're really, really effective. The people that need to be cautious about their use or should definitely speak with their doctor before using any are those with, say, kidney disease or taking blood pressure medications that might increase their potassium levels. So there are certain concerns that way. But ultimately, I think it's a really, really good idea. So how to choose one and what you should be aiming for sort of depends on your palate. So I actually personally use 100% potassium, 100% potassium option, and I think it's fine. Other people believe, or we'll say about 3/4 roughly, or just over 3/4 can taste a bit of a sourness to it. So for them, mixing sodium and potassium is better. If you look at a 50-50 split of sodium and potassium, most people can't tell the difference. It tastes the same, but you get half the sodium, which is obviously a good thing. So it'll depend. There are products like low salt or light salt that are a mix. And then there's products like Windsor Salt Free. There's one called No Salt, another one called, I think, New Salt. These are all 100% potassium. So there's different options available, but I think they're a really, really good idea for managing blood pressure, provided, again, you aren't on medications that would make it contraindicated or you don't have kidney disease.
Yeah, that makes me wonder, like, why don't a lot of these meat alternative products have a potassium chloride or something that's to bring the salt level down. But if there's contraindications, you think that might be the reason?
See, I don't know if that's necessarily the reason, because people with, well, particularly when it comes to kidney disease, are likely managing their sodium anyway. So I don't
Mhm.
know how much different that would be. Now, for some of the medications, like potassium sparing medications, then it makes more sense that it would be geared towards potassium. So maybe that's it. But we are seeing it more. So the new Beyond Burger, one of the ways that they lowered their sodium content was by including a potassium-based salt. So I think there might be some regulatory hurdles, or some regulations around like how much you can add, and those sorts of things. So I don't know the ins and outs of all of that, but we are starting to see some of it. And hopefully it's something that can be done at scale, but I don't really know at this point. At least I don't know what the hurdles are.
Gotcha. What are your thoughts on the almighty egg?
It's a very nuanced topic. I guess depends how much detail you want to go into. I can try to give sort of a surface level explanation, and then if you want me to dive into more details, we can.
Well,
But
let me, so
yeah,
it's just, I guess for me, and I'm just going to jump in for a sec
yeah,
before you answer. I'm surprised how many people still think that eggs are healthy. I think they're heart healthy. I just got finished playing pickleball the other day, and I handed one of these players a bag of the Plant Strong 9-grain pancake and waffle mix, and he says, "No, I don't do grains." He's like, "I just do eggs in the morning." And I didn't say anything. I just like, okay, hey, thanks, no problem. But eggs. What's the deal with eggs?
yeah. So I think a lot of people can probably relate to that sort of story, and myself as well. But I think it depends on two really important factors that a lot of people just don't pay much attention to. So one of them is the dose. So you have to look at how much egg we're talking about. If you're talking about an egg or two a week, that's not going to really do anything. If you're talking about every day, then that starts to matter.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you look at studies where you're comparing a difference of about an egg a day, so those consuming low amounts of eggs are having maybe one or two a week at most, and those eating a lot of eggs are having, we'll say, at least 7 more than that a week, roughly an egg a day. In those cases, very consistently, we see higher risks of cardiovascular disease in those consuming more eggs versus those consuming less. But there's another really important variable, and that's what you're comparing it to. So when you compare eggs to meat, other cholesterol-containing foods, which we'll say is mostly meat, in those cases, eggs are actually beneficial. They actually lower your risk compared to meat. So if you replace meat with eggs, that's a good swap health-wise. But if you replace eggs with plant protein sources, you lower your risk even more. So eggs are, we'll say, harmful, at least for heart health, if you're consuming them regularly instead of plants. But if you're consuming them instead of meat, they could be considered beneficial.
Help
Right?
me
So
out.
yeah.
Yeah, but help me out here. What is it in? Is it what is it in the meat that makes meat that much worse than the egg?
So there's probably a couple things. One of them is definitely the saturated fat. So most meats, unless you're having really lean cuts, are going to have more saturated fat than eggs. And saturated fat is even worse than cholesterol. Cholesterol has a smaller impact on our blood levels of cholesterol, and it's also variable depending on genetics. Whereas with saturated fat, it's more consistent and a larger effect. So that's one issue. Meats, especially red meats, are also rich in things like heme iron, which may play a role in cardiovascular health. There's some evidence supporting that. And there's other compounds. I mean, there's a lot of speculation around things like new 5GC and whatnot that are in the meats, but can we pin down exactly what role those play? Not at this point. It's mostly preclinical studies done in with cell cultures in petri dish or in animal models, and so we can't necessarily say like this is responsible for 15% of the risk in humans or whatever. We can't draw those lines yet. But there are reasons to believe that that there is something contributing to a higher risk in meat, and we can kind of speculate around what that is.
Yeah. So okay, anything else around the egg, Or
I think those are the big ones. Oh, actually, you know what? I think this is worth mentioning, and maybe we'll get in, as you mentioned, the protein topic later on. But I also see a lot of people saying that like we need to eat eggs for protein, and that, I mean, if you replace eggs with tofu, same amount of calories from either, you get actually quite a bit more protein from tofu, like a tofu scramble. Even if you replaced eggs with like an egg alternative, like just egg, you get the same amount of protein. You know, like there are other options out there, which I just find kind of funny.
Yeah. Trying to think which direction I want to go with you right here, right now. There's so many different places. Let me see here. One of the things that's really steaming my clams these days is all these people that all of a sudden are thinking that oatmeal is not healthy because it raises their blood sugar levels. They're wearing these continuing glucose monitors, and oh my God, I can't believe what it does when I eat oatmeal. Can you help clarify that oatmeal is in fact healthy and a good food for us to eat?
Yeah, so I mean, there's like multiple layers to this. So for starters, this idea that raising blood glucose rising after a meal is a bad thing just has no basis in the evidence. So it's normal when you eat carbohydrates like oats, or whether that's like even a whole wheat bread or some fruit. It's normal for your blood sugar to go up a little bit and then it just comes back down. That's normal. That's what should happen, and that's what you want. The problem is where it goes up and it stays up because you have a lot of insulin resistance or diabetes from, you know, excess body fat accumulation, or, you know, we can talk about more of those details later maybe. But it is completely normal, has never been shown to translate into worse outcomes in humans, to have these, you know, slight, you know, rises and drops. But again, what we want to do is go back to what is the end result? What are the outcomes? And we have long-term studies like the Nurses' Health Study, Health Professionals Follow-Up Study running for like 3 decades. Those who consume more oatmeal than those who consume less have lower risks of coronary heart disease. That's a good thing. You know, these glucose spikes aren't hurting you in those cases. We also have randomized controlled trials where oatmeal improves a bunch of blood parameters like your LDL cholesterol levels, for example. We have the same sort of data on fruits and higher fruit consumption associated with lower risks of cardiovascular disease. And what's really ironic about it is that people will then swap things like oatmeal for bacon and eggs because those don't have carbohydrates and aren't going to, quote unquote, spike your glucose as much, but they're actually associated with higher risks of those diseases. So you're actually choosing something that's worse for your health because on your CGM you see this little bump. And it just doesn't make sense. It's actually harmful in the long run. So I would certainly advise people to, again, focus on what is the end result? What is the final outcome? Not these like intermediate markers. Like, look, I can actually make an argument that exercise is bad for you based on the same kind of speculation. I can say exercise increases inflammation, which is true. If you exercise, your inflammatory markers can rise depending on how hard you exercise for a day or two, roughly. And then I can, you know, fearmonger say, hey, see, inflammation or markers of inflammation rise. Inflammation is associated with heart disease, therefore exercise is bad. But obviously that's insane because at the end of the day, exercise is incredibly beneficial and lowers your risk of disease. So that's the type of sort of gymnastics that are going on here.
Well, wouldn't it be interesting if somebody would come out and say that exercise is bad for us? He or she would probably get a lot of attention.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I think they would be universally bashed for it. And that's what's so like incredible about this is when it comes to things like oatmeal. It's like normal to just accept that, oh yeah, it's bad for you because of this wild speculation. It's weird. You wouldn't get the same response with exercise.
Yeah. You know, since 2010, I've been throwing these 6 or 7 day Plan Strong total immersions, and all we're feeding people in the morning primarily is fruit and steel cut oats. And a lot of people, they come in the first day and their baseline fasting glucose is well over 100, sometimes, 125, 135. And typically by the time they leave 6 or 7 days later, it's below 100. right? So they've gone from basically pre-diabetic to being fine. Again, eating fruit, eating oatmeal and potatoes and rice and beans and all this stuff. You get it. What about fruit? Can you believe how many people these days are afraid of the sugar that's in fruit, and all these influencers that are continuing to, kind of encourage this behavior?
Yeah. Fruit contains sugar, obviously, but also contains a ton of fiber. It's high in water content, or most of them are high in water content, rich in polyphenols that actually lead to changes in sort of the absorption or regulation of the glucose in the blood. But at the same time, I think the concerns come from sort of a misunderstanding of what causes diabetes or type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance. And like the primary driver by far is excess body fat accumulation. Basically, when you pack on enough body fat, especially if it's around the liver or in the liver and pancreas eventually, that's what leads to insulin resistance. And things like fruit are so low in calorie density, so filling, so rich in fiber, that they actually seem to aid in fat loss and ultimately improve blood glucose regulation. Now, if you have really bad, like insulin-dependent diabetes, you're going to want to work with a professional to sort of, how do you increase carbohydrate intake while managing your glucose? Like there are certain factors there that you have to consider. But at least while you're on the road to recovery, hopefully. But in cases of most people who are just trying to manage their health, or even people with, say, prediabetes, consuming fruits can actually be a really good thing for managing those glucose levels.
Oh yeah, I mean, you look at the work that Cyrus Kambata and Robbie Barbero have done with Mastering Diabetes, and I mean, they're practically fruitarians.
Yeah,
I mean, it's kind of intense how much fruit they eat, fruit and green leafies and vegetables and chickpeas, and those guys are like hitting a home run. It's really wild, and all the people they're working with. Let's wade into the topic of protein, and because I know that you have some thoughts on protein from everything that I've read and heard. From your vantage point, you, I think, believe that we should be getting more protein, not less protein. If that is in fact correct, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think to start, we should understand. So the recommended dietary allowance, that's at least in North America, that's what we use as far as recommendations, is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So you take your weight in kilograms, whatever that is, multiply it by 0.8. And as far as like government recommendations, that's what you should be getting. Now, that is based on what are called nitrogen balance studies. So they basically look at how much nitrogen, which is found in protein, you consume, and how much you're excreting. And ultimately, you want to take in more than you lose. And that's sort of where those numbers come from. However, as we've sort of progressed and done more research on this, we see that especially in older populations, increasing protein up to about 1.1 or 1.2 grams per kilogram, so we'll say up to about 50% higher, seem to help for things like bone health, so maintaining bone mineral density with age, helping with maintaining muscle mass or improving muscle mass if that's your goal. And so I do think that there are advantages to going a little bit higher. Also, when we look at studies on higher versus lower protein intake and risks of mortality, so risk of dying during a given study and say like middle-aged to older adults, we see that higher protein intake, specifically when it's from plants, and that's very important. We do not see this with animal protein, but higher protein intakes from plants are associated with lower risks, so essentially longer life or lower risk of premature death. And so again, that's another reason I think focusing on a bit more of those plant protein rich foods like your legumes, your tofu, et cetera, are a good idea. Does that mean you should be hitting, or you need to be hitting the 1 gram per pound or like 2 grams per kilogram that you'll see some of the gym fitness community saying? No, I don't think so at all. I don't think there's any advantage to going quite that high, whether it's for muscle mass gains or for health. So I don't think we need to be aiming quite that high.
Well, what you mentioned, particularly the aging kind of population could probably benefit from more protein. Do you think that's in part because as many people age, they're consuming less total calories?
That's a part of it, and also our ability to digest and absorb protein seems to decline with age. So it's super reliant on stomach acid production, and stomach acid production typically declines as we get older, and that's one of the reasons that vitamin B12 supplementation is recommended even in omnivores or meat eaters who are over age, say like 50 or so, maybe 65, depending on which jurisdiction you're looking at. But it's the same sort of mechanism. They both rely on stomach acid production.
Mm-hmm. So, and I know you've got all kinds of studies to back up what you said. Did you get a chance to look at or read any of Dr. Michael Greger's How Not to Age? Because I know in his book, and he's got 13,000 different citations in there, he's an advocate for longevity and health span of actually reducing protein intake. And my understanding is that, like most Americans, most people are getting twice, according to Dr. Greger, twice the protein that they should be right now. And if we just dialed it back to like 9% of calories instead of 16 to 18, that we'd all be better off. And he cites the 11 pathways to kind of slow down the aging process. And the one that seems to hit every single one of them is a reduction in protein intake, even more so than calorie restriction. So love to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I've read, I can't remember every little detail, but basically what you just said aligns with what I recall. What I would say is that I focus more so on the outcomes than these mechanisms. So we can, again, look at these individual pathways and the proposed mechanisms by which they might affect one thing or another. But, and he actually notes this in his book as well, when you separate out plant protein and animal protein, they do not have the same effect on outcomes. Plant protein is consistently beneficial when it comes to long-term health outcomes, whether that's risk of frailty, healthy aging, risks of cardiovascular disease or mortality. And so I actually don't see any outcome-based evidence. So actually looking again at the final result, any outcome-based evidence suggesting that plant protein is harmful at some level of intake. Mm-hmm. But there is evidence pointing towards benefits to going higher. And so that's why I would advocate for higher intake, despite, we can speculate about these mechanisms for, one pathway or another. The end result is the end result. And so there could be things like, you have to think, for everything we consume, there are hundreds to potentially thousands of different mechanisms occurring at any one time. And the net result will show up in those final outcomes. So that's my take. Maybe I'll have to discuss it with him at some point when we get a chance.
Yeah. Well, and then, we all know about the blue zones and the Okinawans that 85% of their caloric intake is coming from, or used to come from, the sweet potato, and 7 to 8% of their calories are coming from protein. And they're the, more centenarians than any other, population out there.
But what's interesting about them is, at least for the women, their protein intake is around what I recommend. If you break it down into grams per kilogram, the men do fall a little below that. Mm-hmm. But for the women, it is around that 1.2. And also, when we look at vegan populations and the sort of ranges of protein intake, on average, vegans are meeting at least the RDA or exceeding it. But there are people who fall even below that, even below the low recommendations, which is something to be concerned about. And that's another reason I would push a little bit higher, so it gives you a little bit of a safety net.
My understanding is that those recommendations are actually with a built-in safety margin of about 30%.
Sort of. So they're based on, basically, we have what's called the estimated average requirement. So that's basically the target that we would need to meet, or we would need to hit to meet the needs of about 50% of the population. And then they scale it up to cover about 97% of the population.
Right.
So there's still, like, you could be on the higher end of that bell curve. And usually males will be maybe active males or athletes in general would be a little bit higher on that bell curve. But it's sort of has a built-in safety net, but not for everybody. Mm-hmm. Right? It just depends on where on that bell curve you would fit.
Right. So I want to ask you about oils. We made lock horns here a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit
on oils. I just personally. I'm like, I look at oil and I'm like, all right, it's 100% fat. There's no protein. There's no fiber. There's no water. There's really nothing to speak of when it comes to vitamins and minerals, scant amount of, phytonutrients. To me, it is the equivalent of kind of what white sugar is in the carbohydrate world. And so, and I obviously have gone through your Instagram feed, and it sounds like you are, I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're, what are your thoughts on oils? And then let's talk about, and specifically, let's talk about olive oil.
Yeah. So I think, for starters, I think there are definitely areas where we differ there. And I do think they can be absolutely a healthy option. But I also think there are some things that we probably agree on. So for one, when we look at research on whether it's olive oil or other unsaturated fat-rich oils, and again, long-term outcomes, we see reductions in things like cardiovascular risk. Now, if we were to compare that to something specifically, we see the largest improvements compared to butter. Obviously, that's not a very high bar to set. But I think we can probably both agree that compared to butter, something like olive oil or another plant-based oil is probably a good choice. Now, where I think we can make a compelling argument, or I can make a compelling argument that these oils can fit into a healthy diet, even when we consider more whole food sources, is we have what are called substitution analyses, where they look at the substitution of one food for another when you keep the rest of the diet about the same, and you consider other variables like exercise and smoking and so on. And in those cases, we see compared to avocado, whole avocado, the plant-based oils are typically about the same as far as cardiovascular outcomes, and avocado is very good for heart health. When we look at even carbohydrates from whole grains, if anything, polyunsaturated fats, primarily from vegetable oils, are even better than the carbohydrates from whole grains. That said, it doesn't mean it's necessary. Like, you can get these polyunsaturated fats from things like nuts and seeds as well. It doesn't have to be sourced from oil. And I actually think the strongest argument somebody can make against oil is possibly the calorie density of it. So they do provide some nutrition, like vitamin E, for example, and as you mentioned, some polyphenols, depending on the type of oil, more or less. But the calorie density, especially if you're using several tablespoons every day, can add up 120 calories per tablespoon. We saw in that recent study looking at olive oil in a higher fat versus lower fat diet, worse blood biomarkers, but they were having like 500 calories of oil. That's a lot of oil. I would certainly not advocate somebody use that much, but if you are using like a tablespoon or even half a tablespoon to season a pan or to add into a salad to increase consumption of things like veggies, that can be a really good use for that for a lot of people. And especially if you're adding like spices or seasonings and the oil kind of helps soak that up a little bit better, I think those can be positives. So that would kind of be my broad overview of the topic. And yeah, you can let me know if you have any questions or pushback perhaps.
Well, I have a hard time believing that you're better off having an oil instead of whole grains. That somehow, what did you say? That it's more and it's less. There's less inflammation, or
no, sorry. So it was a study. This was, I believe, the Nurses' Health study looking at cardiovascular outcomes, so risk of heart attack or stroke. And when they replaced saturated fat with carbohydrates from whole grains, that was beneficial. So that was clearly beneficial. But when they replaced saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats, it was even more beneficial than with the whole grains. And now there's one caveat to add, that this was if you equate calories. So is it possible that in a real world setting, you would probably eat more calories from the oil? I think you could grant that as a reasonable speculation. But the other thing is, when it comes to cholesterol, like LDL cholesterol levels, polyunsaturated fats have the biggest effect of all the macronutrients. So they actually lower those numbers the most. So in people with higher cholesterol levels, more polyunsaturated fats would probably reduce that number more than anything else. And so that would be one reason that they could be, even better, perhaps.
Yeah, but when you say more polyunsaturated fats, like that's very nebulous. Like how much are we talking about here? Are we talking about like the equivalent of a teaspoon of, I don't know, some sort of oil, or are we talking about half a handful of walnuts?
Yeah, so I think in that particular study, it was 5% of calories. It might have been 3% of calories, but let's just say it was 5% to make the math easy. That would be about a tablespoon of oil, or just over that. We'll say a tablespoon of oil plus a little bit of nuts maybe in your day. So it's not like you're adding a quarter cup of it or anything like that.
Yeah. What so you mentioned polyphenols, and I looked it up a little bit, and in my research what I saw was that if you have let's just say 100 grams in black olives, that's like 3.5 ounces. Okay. It's about 115 calories, and it's got 117 milligrams of polyphenols in it. So, almost 1-to-1, right? Calories to milligrams. You look at olive oil and you get 400 calories to 55 milligrams of polyphenols. And my point here is that, to me, I don't see a world where the refined, processed version of the whole food is ever going to be more beneficial for you.
I see. So I would say a couple things. For one, it'd be a hard sell to consume that many olives for most people, right? So you have to look at more like feasibility as well. When it comes to olive oil, a lot more people will consume that at hopefully less than 400 calories worth in a go, but even like half of that in a serving, it'd be a more realistic source of some of those polyphenols. And also the polyphenol content's highly variable. So there can be products with more or less. But that said, it's not necessarily that a food needs to be the best in order to make it something we can recommend. So for example, if we look at fruits, berries are, I'd say as far as the clinical trial data we have, probably the best. Does that mean I would say, oh, you shouldn't eat watermelon because it's not as good? No. Or bananas, it's not as good as berries. Absolutely not. I think they're both fine and they both have benefits. One might be better than the other, but that doesn't mean we have to advise against something like a watermelon or a banana because it doesn't have that same polyphenol content as like blueberries. So I think there's ways for that to fit in, but it's not necessary. Like, I think that's another thing that we can both agree on. There is no world in which it's necessary to consume oils.
You're right.
I just think that if it makes it easier for someone to eat more vegetables, for example, then go for it. Within a reasonable amount. Don't go crazy, obviously, but I don't want people guzzling the stuff, but within a reasonable amount, a tablespoon or so, to saute some veggies, fine.
I absolutely agree with you there. Where I have an issue is you look at the average American right now, and I bet you they're consuming between the packaged box canned foods that they're eating and what they have at home, their salads, their stir fries, whatever it is. I bet you most Americans are consuming somewhere between 3 to 5 tablespoons of oil a day. I don't think that's
unreasonable.
That's an exaggeration.
I think that's probably close.
That's almost, if you're on a 2,000 a day 2,000 a day calorie diet, that's basically almost 25% of your calories that are coming from 100% fat. And you know about my father's work, and how he is an absolute taskmaster, and with his patients, where it basically is life and death, he basically says, I don't want you guys doing any oils. I don't want you doing a thimbleful of oil, because he knows if he basically gives them permission to do a thimbleful, it's what we talked about at the very, very top of this broadcast, right? Human nature, it's all of a sudden a slippery slope. And my father, I think you would agree, has gotten some of the most incredible before and after angiographic results on the planet, showing that you can actually reverse heart disease with a low-fat, no-added oil, whole food, plant-based diet.
So I actually think on that, there was really good discussions around the oil and the reversal stuff in that podcast I mentioned with Gil Carvalho from Nutrition Made Simple, that interview with your dad, which I commend him for doing. I thought there was a lot of like really good, nitty-gritty sort of questions and stuff. So I recommend people watch that. But at the same time, I would just push back a little bit to say that I don't think I don't think allowing someone to include some oils, if let's say it's for the purposes of sauteing some veggies, will lead to higher caloric intake, really, when you consider the alternative, right? So if we take people eating the standard American diet and we're trying to get them onto more veggies and they're using oils specifically for the cooking, let's say they don't want to do, veggie broths or whatever alternative, the overall calorie density of those meals will likely be very low. And that's why in trials, we don't typically see weight gain with oils. Like even in that olive oil versus low fat study, the recent one, the parameters improved in both groups. Even with olive oil, they improved, just not necessarily as much.
Yeah.
Because they were having 400 or 500 calories worth of the oils.
Yeah. Well, I used to be a firefighter. And when a house would burn down, you'd have to have somebody that would basically monitor that house for usually at least 24 hours, because you have something called spot fires that will basically ignite if you're not constantly putting it out. And just to the audience that's listening to this, and to you, Matt, you remember, my father's typically dealing with people that have, many of them, end-stage heart disease, people that have had 47 stents put into their arteries, 47. And so he's playing hardball with people that want to live. And he has, he's been doing this since 1984. And so I actually called him up yesterday to ask him a couple of questions about this. And he said, the problem, Rip, is that when I gave and asked my patients to go ahead, add a little olive oil back into your diet, because some of these guys were, from Italy and it was in their blood, they had to have some. Literally within 3 weeks, the angina would come back. These basically conditions would come back. Now, I know that this is more of a story, but for my father, who's been, basically shoulder to the grindstone with this since 1984, and has worked with literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, and has gone over every morsel that they eat. And with his first initial patients, every other week for 5 years. Right. And then, so I give the guy, right, a lot of credit for being so hardcore with people that want to live and just can't go a little bit. It's like the person that has a little bit of chocolate, the next thing you know, they're they're in trouble. So when I look at oil, I just see basically white sugar, the white sugar of the fat world. And I understand when you say, yeah, but if you use a little bit here to basically saute your veggies and it adds spices and, all that, I get that. I think it depends upon who you are, what your health condition is, and what happens. I mean, go ahead, experiment and see what happens. But to me, given the fact that, it's what, 14, olive oil is 14, 15% saturated fat. It's only 11% polyunsaturated fat, and the remaining 75% is monounsaturated fat. I don't view it as a health food.
And that's fair if that's your opinion. Obviously, if it leads someone to, consuming quarter cup of it, or some going crazy, like some of those studies with the artery function, they were giving like a quarter cup basically to measure the temporary changes in our arterial function. In cases like that, I can see an argument, absolutely. But again, we have good data on, like, say, Mediterranean diets and cardiovascular outcomes. We have good data.
But is the Mediterranean diet, is you think that it's the olive oil that helped out?
No,
or you
no.
think it's all the
I
other?
think it's a part of it. I think it's a part of it. So even if we look at things like PrediMed, where they compare either a Mediterranean diet with olive oil versus a Mediterranean diet with nuts, the outcomes are about the same. And if we look at CardioPrev more recently, where they actually used more,
But they both, whether it was the oil or the nuts, they both developed heart disease over that period.
Oh, much lower risk than the placebo group. And if we look at the Cardioprev trial, for example, where they actually measure plaque
but,
regression.
but
Sorry?
do you want to halt the disease, or do you want it to continue to progress slowly?
Well, ideally, you want to halt the disease, but what I'm getting to
And
is we have data on.
we know exactly how to do that. We know.
I would argue that we don't.
We do. I think Ornish and my father have shown very successfully that you know how to do that.
So, but if we look at the Cardioprev trial, which was a Mediterranean diet, which also looked at more accurate measures of plaque progression than, say, in the Ornish trial, we see regression of plaque in that case as well with high levels of olive oil. When we look at actual cardiovascular outcomes, comparing specific foods, like I said, whole grains to, say, polyunsaturated fat-rich oils, which not necessarily olive oil, but other oils, we see lower risks of cardiovascular disease events. If you look at blood biomarkers of polyunsaturated fats, higher levels of polyunsaturated fats in the blood lead to lower risk of cardiovascular outcomes. We have long-term randomized controlled trials like the LA Veterans Administration Hospital study, lowering risk. I think we have a lot of really good data suggesting that these foods can be healthy. And we have like randomized trials comparing things like polyunsaturated fat-rich oils or even olive oil to whole food sources, suggesting improvements in biomarkers. So I just don't think we can make a strong argument for completely halting the disease when even in cases like if we look at your father's data, like some of them are on cholesterol-lowering meds as well. We can't pin it straight on diet.
Mm-hmm. Well, know that for the first almost 15 years, cholesterol-lowering drugs didn't exist. When he had this most profound before and after angiographic research, no cholesterol-lowering drugs didn't exist.
But that was in like one patient, right?
This was in several patients.
So I'd have to look at that. I know the one famous image was one patient, and there. This is actually brought up in the podcast, or sorry, the interview with Gil Carvalho as well. Is that even your father agreed that it could be due to the angle of the images and whatnot. Like there are things that can happen. We see that actually in angiograms occasionally where it'll look like something completely cleared up, but it could be due to vasodilation of the artery. It could be due to the angle of the imaging. I just don't think from these limited cases we can draw firm conclusions that it quote unquote opened up. That's not to say that regression isn't possible. I mean, we see trials like Cardioprev where we have decent evidence of some regression, but I also don't think it's important. I think that's one of the things that that gets sort of ignored is that what we should care about, or what most of us care about, are the outcomes. Like, what is the final result? Does it lead to a higher risk of heart disease or not? Or having a heart attack or a stroke or not? Like, you could technically have some regression of the plaque and have a higher risk of heart disease, depending on how it was regressed. So I would really advocate that we focus more on the long-term clinical outcomes. And I know your dad's gotten good results of that. I know that if we look at the 5-year results of the Ornish trial, there were good results with that are comparable to what we see with some of the Mediterranean diet data, right? Even if we look at Ornish's, not everyone was free of having events at the end of the day, right? There were just less events, significantly less events, which is what we care about, which is why I'm an advocate for plant-based diet.
Yeah, and you look at my father's results that were published in the
JAMA, I think?
The Journal of Family Practice in 2014. The title was "A Way to Prevent Cardiovascular Disease." Yeah, CAD. And he basically was checking up on 198 patients after 4 years to find out what was the adherence, right? And then how many cardiovascular events had there been. 89% adherence rate. One person had, I think it was a small stroke. Of the 21 patients that did not adhere, went off, did their own thing, 26 different events. So that to me, Matt, is pretty darn powerful that this is arresting and halting the disease. 4 years, that's substantial.
Yeah, that's definitely substantial, and kudos to all those people who stuck with the program. Obviously, like that was, and we have good reason to believe that was of significant benefit. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily comparing apples to oranges, though, in that people who weren't adherent to the diet, were they as adherent with other healthy lifestyle behaviors? Like probably not. I think it's reasonable to assume that they probably weren't as healthy overall. That said, yeah, significantly less rates of cardiovascular disease, and that's in line with other data. We would suspect there to be less risk of cardiovascular disease from eating that way. So I'm definitely a proponent for eating a plant-based diet. I just don't think it's necessarily evidence of completely, avoidance of oil being what drives that. I think there are a lot of other
Oh,
factors that.
I
Yeah.
wasn't saying that either. I was just
Yeah.
saying
Okay.
it was the whole food plant-based diet that is doing it, and the no oil on top. Let's just say that was the cherry on top of it. But the other thing that you have to realize, Matt, is that with my father's patients, the only thing he wants them focusing on is the food. It's like exercise, no. Stress management, no. Meditation, no. I only want you focusing on the food, and I want you to get that right. And if you can get that right, you're good to go. So, I think I've heard you and some other people say, well, there's all these other factors that potentially were going on, and I know that, my hat goes off to Dean and all the incredible work that he's done, right? But he recommends stress reduction, meditation, exercise. So those were not really taken into account with my dad's work.
Yeah, and like I didn't mean to suggest that they were changing those behaviors. I was just suggesting that if someone's not adherent to the diet, chances are when it comes to those other behaviors, they typically aren't as good with those either, right? Like even though they weren't necessarily recommended for or against. But that said, I mean, I think we agree on a lot around the diet and cardiovascular disease and how beneficial it is to prevent that. It's just is there a little more leeway in how it's done? I think I would argue that there could be, but that's really the only big difference there.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to beat a dead horse here or a dead piece of kale here, but I think that the bedrock of the success of my father has been his no leniency, right? And so, yes, you're more lenient, but how many people have you worked with end stage heart disease over the course of your career?
I mean, it's a pretty young career so far, but I haven't really worked with too many end stage. I've worked with quite a number who've had stents and are looking to manage their risk now, but not end stage per se.
Yeah.
They don't usually send them to me.
Yeah. So, and obviously, I'm defending my father here, right? I mean, I love his work. I love what he's done. I think he's been an amazing pioneer and trailblazer, and I think his methodology kind of in his work stands on its own. So we can move on.
Sounds good.
I appreciate you the conversation around that, though. There's been a lot of noise as of late with creatine. What's your thoughts on creatine? Is that something that I should be taking? I've never taken it before.
So it's not an essential nutrient. So creatine is actually something we produce. We have it. We store it in our brain. We store it in our muscle. I would say most people are familiar with creatine as it pertains to strength or resistance training. A lot of people use it in those sorts of settings. And it's actually a form of energy. So when it comes to power output, if you think about more explosive behaviors, some like explosive sort of power lifts or sprints, things like that, it helps fuel those, at least those initial couple seconds. And supplementation with creatine while training has been shown to improve strength. It's probably one of the most consistent findings. And I would say that it's probably the most well-studied supplement in the world. It's certainly one of them, if still not number one. Incredibly safe. We have very good data on that, even for long-term use at like high doses above what's typically recommended. So should people use it? I think if you're in the fitness community and you're looking to maximize strength gains in particular, I think it's a really good idea. Are there other benefits? Potentially. There's some limited data for cognitive benefits. I would say we need a bit more research there, a bit more high quality research there before I double down on recommending it for that purpose. But I think there's enough to maybe consider it. There's also some research, actually a recent one just came out a couple days ago, a trial on older adults looking at possible acute benefits, like short-term benefits in arterial function or certain markers of arterial function. There's some research on postmenopausal women and improving bone mineral density as well. So there are there are enough benefits there that I think it's a decent idea, but I would stop short of saying it's absolutely necessary. Simply, maybe I need creatine. My brain wasn't working there. But I would stop short of saying that it's absolutely necessary. As we do make it, we produce it ourselves. It's just that we can get more through supplements and maximize our creatine stores by regularly supplementing.
Do different individuals produce different amounts of creatine?
Yeah, possibly. And also dosage recommendations can be modified based on your weight. So it's typically dosed per weight as well. That said, a 5 gram a day dose, which is like one little scoop that typically comes with it, or about a rounded teaspoon, is a pretty standard recommendation. It's more than some people will need, but it's not really overdoing it. You would just excrete the excess.
Are you supplementing with creatine?
Yeah, actually, it's funny enough. I started, when did I start? Maybe a couple years ago. It was when Simon Hill was doing a lot of content on creatine, then I started diving more into it. And I thought, hey, I'll give it a try. And yeah, been doing it ever since.
What are your thoughts on organic versus conventional food?
Yeah, I feel like this is one that, I don't know what your position is. I feel like it's one that might stir things up a little bit. I actually don't think there's good evidence for benefits of organic over non-organic in most cases. So when it comes to nutritional content, they're pretty comparable. There might be slight advantages one way or another. When it comes to land use, environmental impact, conventional is actually better than non-organic in a lot of metrics. And when you consider the cost, I think it's ridiculous. It's like double the cost sometimes, and it makes it really difficult for some people to afford those products. But when we consider how, and this isn't exact, but I'm going to just outline a little bit about how pesticides, like the amounts of pesticide exposure, is sort of calculated or allowed. Basically, they'll test different levels of exposure in often animal models. I know a lot of us aren't fans of that, and hopefully we can do away with that at some point, but it is what's done currently. And they'll test different levels of exposure. They'll find the lowest level that causes any kind of issue, and then they'll scale it back by 100 times as being the maximum amount, like relative to a human's body weight. They'll scale it back about 100 times for what we're allowed to be exposed to. So we're exposed to absolutely tiny, tiny amounts. And most studies, they fall victim. Like if you look at studies linking pesticide exposure to some kind of harms, they're usually done in workers in fields. And what happens is they're sprayed with this stuff all day, every day. And so they're exposed to a crazy amount. When you actually look at human consumption of organic versus non-organic, it's pretty much a wash. Like you don't really see much risk there when they consider other healthy lifestyle behaviors. Like, again, people who eat organic probably exercise more and do other things, but when you consider those variables, you don't really see much either way. It's pretty neutral.
That's some really good information. Now, I'm a fan of, I just want people to get more whole plants into their bodies, right? Whether it's conventional, whether it's organic, whether it's frozen, whether it's fresh. I think it's all, I think at some point you decide what's important to you and do it. But I tell people, this is not, how was I going to get a bunch of Texas male firefighters to do this if I told them you had to have an organic $4.99 bell pepper, right? It wasn't going to fly. And I'm just trying to get 100%. white bread and bologna.
Yeah. And even if we were to grant some kind of harm from that exposure, which again, I don't think we have good reason to believe there's any harm from the pesticide exposure at the level that we get. But even if we were to grant that there's some harm, the benefits of eating these foods and all the components that they have, like inherently, polyphenols, phytonutrients, the fiber, et cetera, would so far outweigh those risks, it's absurd. And so I just really don't want the label of organic versus non-organic to be a hindrance for somebody to eat this way.
Great. Good point. I got about 3 more questions for you. You good to go?
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I'm good.
Fantastic. So I saw in one of your Instagram posts a correlation between lack of sleep and food intake. What can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, that was you really did a deep dive. That was a little while ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can't remember all the details of that study, but my parents, for reference, they own a couple mattress stores and they wanted me to look into some sleep stuff. So I did kind of for fun. Maybe that so they can, throw some stuff at their customers. I don't know. But yeah, so I did a bit of a dive into the research on lack of sleep and food consumption. And it was something like for each hour less per night, below about 7 hours. Again, I'm going off of memory here, but it was something like for each hour less, there was a 200 or 300 calories more consumed per night, or something like that, or per day rather. And so lack of sleep seems to increase food consumption. Now, is that because as you're up later, you end up eating later at night and adding the calories? Maybe. Is that because lack of sleep somehow affects our hunger or satiation mechanisms? Possibly. The exact explanations aren't super clear, but yeah, it does seem to have an effect. And then we can also look at downstream effects, like lack of sleep affects our overall mortality risk or heart disease risk or diabetes risk. Like there's a lot of connections there.
Yeah. You mentioned satiation there. Is there any data or research that suggests that protein is more satiating than anything else?
So there's a lot of people that claim that it is, and there's a reason for that. So if you look at studies on, or we'll say most studies on protein consumption and satiation, basically like fullness, how full you are, how little you eat after the fact. When you look at those studies, you'll sometimes find that the higher protein foods are more satiating, more filling, so you end up eating less and therefore promote weight loss. The problem is most of those studies compare a protein-rich food to a very like hyper-palatable, ultra-processed food that's not going to be very filling for other reasons besides the protein content. There are only a couple studies that have like really rigorously designed them to provide either higher protein or lower protein in a beverage with like the same consistency. You can't really tell the difference. Or if it's not a beverage, in a food, again, where they sort of mimic the textures and everything and the overall mass. And when you do that, protein does not seem to be satiating, more satiating, does not seem to promote weight loss or less food consumption. So protein inherently doesn't seem to be satiating or more satiating. But if we look at in general, protein-rich foods tend to be more satiating than a lot of like refined grain-based foods, for example. So, eat more beans and whatnot, of course, for a number of reasons. And one of them is that they're filling, but it's not just because of the protein.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then when you look at, I would say most animal-based protein foods, they probably have more fat than they do protein in them. Like
A lot of them, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Dr. McDougall would always say that the most satiating food on the planet is a sweet potato, big old sweet potato. And what is a sweet potato? It's mostly carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm. And fiber, which is a carbohydrate, but very filling, of course. And yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on gluten? I just can't believe how many people that I meet say that they're staying away from gluten. And when I ask them why, they just basically say, I was told by my trainer or my mother. And then when you ask them, well, what is gluten? They don't even know what gluten is. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on gluten.
Yeah, so gluten's a protein found in wheat. Some people can have issues with digesting it for a number of reasons. So some may have what's called celiac disease, which is an autoimmune condition where when they consume gluten, their immune system attacks it and it damages their gut lining. And that's a very potentially serious illness that does mean that someone needs to avoid gluten, like even traces of gluten. That affects, estimates vary, we'll say around 1% or so of the population. I've seen numbers from like 0.9% up to about 1.5%, somewhere in there. And then there are some people with what's called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So these are people who might have some issues as far as usually digestion related, as far as like, gas, bloating, abdominal cramps when they consume gluten, but it's not this autoimmune issue. It's not celiac disease. It's not life-threatening, but can be uncomfortable. And again, the estimates range from a couple percent up to like 6 or 7% roughly of the population. So we can say for over 90% of the population, it's a non-issue. Like you're fine with gluten for the most part. Now, what's really interesting is when we look at studies on gluten consumption, or rather gluten-free diets and risks of type 2 diabetes or coronary heart disease, we actually see at like best neutral, or sorry, at worst neutral, at best beneficial effect on those outcomes for eating gluten. So actually eating gluten compared to gluten-free seems to lower risk of type 2 diabetes,
Mm.
possibly lower risk of coronary heart disease. Now, is that because of the gluten? I don't know. I'm not set on that. I think it's probably more likely that people who eat gluten-free eat a lot more refined grain products than whole grains. If you look at what's gluten-free out there, most gluten-free products are refined grain products. They aren't the whole wheat or whole grain versions like a brown rice or whatever.
Yeah.
They're usually white refined flour with the gluten removed, and so that could potentially play a role.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally makes a lot of sense. I think it was in 2023, there was a study or a trial that came out called the Fourier trial, if I'm pronouncing it right, Fourier. And you said it was like the number one the most important research study of the year, as far as I think lowering LDL cholesterol. What was that study all about?
Oh, I can't remember the exact findings, but it was about lowering LDL cholesterol over. It was a very long time frame. So you're digging up these studies that I haven't looked at in a little bit, and it's good though. You're keeping me on my toes. But it was around lowering LDL cholesterol over decades, and I can't remember exactly how long. But substantial reductions in cardiovascular risk. And if I recall, there was a potentially a generational aspect, or they looked at people with familial hypercholesterolemia, which is a genetic aspect. I can't exactly remember, but it was one of these studies in now a long line of studies showing how clearly lowering LDL cholesterol is beneficial for
Right.
cardiovascular risk.
Right. And my follow-up question to that is there such a thing as getting the LDL cholesterol too low?
No. So we have really good data on that. Actually, I think that was one of the aspects of the Fourier trial as well, where they looked at some people with very, very low levels. But that aside, we have studies called Mendelian randomization studies, where people will have sort of genetic variants that lead to very, very low levels of LDL cholesterol, like much lower than you'll ever get with a diet intervention or even most drugs. And they don't have issues with hormone production. They don't have issues with cognitive function. It's totally fine. And that's because all of our cells make all the cholesterol that we need, full stop. We just don't want a lot of it in our blood, where it doesn't really serve much of a purpose. And so we don't see any issue in those genetic studies. And then we have studies on medications called PCSK9 inhibitors, where they just abolish your cholesterol levels down to almost nothing, your LDL cholesterol levels. And again, we don't see any harms as far as hormone production, as far as cognitive function, and we see people living longer lives and a lower risk of cardiovascular disease. So, number one killer. It's a really good thing to lower that. I don't see any good evidence of any harms to having levels too low.
What about HDL levels?
Yeah, so HDL is it's often referred to as sort of the good cholesterol. It has for a long time been associated with good long-term health outcomes, but the issue is that it doesn't seem to be because of the HDL. Higher HDL levels are associated with not smoking. They're associated with exercise. They're associated with other good things that end up lowering risk. But HDL itself doesn't seem to be responsible. So if you look at people with higher genetically determined HDL levels, they don't seem to have a lower risk of cardiovascular disease. If you try drugs they've done trials on these drugs that raise HDL, they don't seem to lower risk of cardiovascular disease. Mm-hmm. But we have that for lowering LDL. We have drug trials where you lower it. We have genetically low levels and they're beneficial. That's how we know that LDL is problematic, and why we don't really think the number of HDL particles or the HDL concentration matters very much.
Yeah. I think I've heard in some individuals that sometimes those elevated HDLs can actually turn into rogue LDLs. Again, it's an HDL posing as an LDL, whatever that means.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what they'd be referring to there, but we do see in people with very high HDL levels that they tend to have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. So it seems to go the other way.
Yeah. Well, I know, for example, my father was telling me about this one woman who was sent to him, and her cardiologist said, with an HDL of 120, you never have to worry about having a heart attack. She had a heart attack, right? And then found my father. But what's also really interesting is that in all the work that I've done in taking people's cholesterol levels since 2010, it's always the women that have occasionally that have these cholesterol levels that are 75 to 110. I never see men with an HDL that high. And I find that to be really kind of peculiar.
Yeah, I haven't actually noticed that as far
Yeah.
as the literature goes, but I'll keep an eye out next time. I honestly don't pay as much attention to the HDL values nowadays, just given what we know about it not being all that important.
Yeah. All right. Here's my last question for you, because this is obviously the hot topic of the year, and it's like Ozempic and Wegovy. Are you pro, con, in between? You think that there's a use case for them? What are your thoughts?
So I'm pro for their use in the way that they are meant to be used. I'm not pro for people using them simply for aesthetic purposes in like Hollywood and that sort of thing. I think that leads to shortages for people who actually need them. And one thing I would just sort of point out is that year after year, for basically our whole lives, the rates of obesity in the US have gone up. Now, prior to 2019, I think it was 2019 or no, 2021, whenever these first got approved. Prior to that, I believe the rate in the US was 41% overweight or obese. Since then, it's dropped to 33. It's the first time ever in our history that has happened. And so it seems like it could potentially be a tool that actually leads to improvement or resolution of this huge issue that has affected us forever at this point. But there are cases where it's indicated and can be used, and there's cases where I think it's being abused for things, like I said, with Hollywood and whatnot.
Yeah. What are you hearing are some of the side effects?
Yeah, so the primary side effects are usually gut related, things like nausea, abdominal discomfort, and those symptoms. But they can largely be mitigated by either reducing dose or increasing at a slower rate. And that's one thing I think people tend to increase too quickly. But if you do have some of those side effects, you're supposed to back off a little bit and maybe to the next tier down, and then either stay there or see if you want to increase later on. So that's one issue that comes up. And that's really the main one. Now, a lot of the side effects that we're seeing are actually quite positive. So we're seeing things, potential benefits for like addiction behaviors, and they're now studying it for those purposes. There are a number of other outcomes that there's a lot of interest in that I think we're going to see more and more research over the next couple of years. But the gut-related side effects are definitely the main one.
Yeah. Help me out here, because I think according to everything that I've read is that you can lose about 10% of your body weight. Is that correlate with what you're seeing or hearing?
It can be more. That's pretty typical over, I can't recall if it's over 1 year or 2 years, something. I think it's about 1 year, 10%, and then it can go beyond that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I just, yeah. So let's say you're 200 pounds and you're down to 180 at the end of the year. What about, I think I've also heard something about like, does this make sense? Facial drooping or something going on with the skin or the face?
Yeah, I've seen those. So that's just a result. So for starters, I think calling it like facial drooping and stuff, it sort of exaggerates it. But you can have that sort of like your cheekbones become more prevalent and whatnot as you start to lose fat, and so it's really just a result of rapid fat loss, especially in the beginning, typically more rapid. It's not due to some effect of the drug independent of that. Right. So it's just one of those things. But yeah, I see it on TikTok and Instagram and all that.
Yeah. Is this something that you prescribe to your patients?
It's something I can prescribe. I have the ability to in my practice, but for any patient who it would have been indicated for, they've already been prescribed prior to seeing me by say their GP. So I haven't had to actually prescribe it, other than like refilling prescriptions.
Right. Matt, I feel like I put you through the ringer today.
Oh, good.
You did a spectacular job, man. That was really incredible, Matt. You know, it was Adam Sudd that told me, he's like, if you haven't had Matt on the podcast yet, you need to get him because this guy is incredible. And, you did not disappoint. Matt, I appreciate everything you're doing. I appreciate the deep dive you're taking into the research, and your cool, calm, and collect personality. And I hope to see you again sometime in the future. Just so people know how to follow you, get in touch with you. Anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, you can follow me on basically any social media platform. Instagram is where I'm most active, but I post those same videos to YouTube, to TikTok, etc. Just at dr.matthewnagra. I also have a website, drmatthewnagra.com, where I'll sometimes publish longer blog articles versus the short snippets that I put on Instagram. And I'll of course link any podcasts like this one there, so people can always make sure they catch up on whatever I'm doing. Other than that, I think I have a few things coming up soon, hopefully that I can announce soon, but I can't quite yet. So,
oh boy,
we'll stay tuned.
Wow, it wouldn't happen to be a book, would it?
Not yet. Working on it.
All right. Hey, Matt, will you give me a virtual fist bump on the way out? Boom.
There it is.
Boom. And Matt, you're not wearing your Plant Strong t-shirt today. I saw it.
Yes, I almost did. And then I thought I'd look a little more professional.
Oh man, look at me. I always wear t-shirts. Yeah. All right. Hey, Matt, have a great rest of your day. Appreciate you.
Thanks, you too.
I really appreciated Dr. Nagra's time and knowledge today, especially with topics that can be so confusing and convoluted. He has a gift of distilling research into easily understandable and digestible segments of knowledge. He's also a great follow on Instagram, and I'll be sure to link up his social media accounts in the show notes to make it super easy for you. As always, thanks so much for listening to the Plant Strong podcast, and I hope that your 2025 is off to a rip-roaring great start. Next week, we're going to teach you how to break up with dairy with Chef Bailey Ruskus. Until then, always keep it plant strong. The Plant Strong podcast team includes Carrie Barrett, Lori Kordowich, and Amy Mackey. If you like what you hear, do us a favor and share the show with your friends and loved ones. You can always leave a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And while you're there, make sure to hit that follow button so that you never miss an episode. As always, this and every episode is dedicated to my parents, Dr. Caldwell B. Esselstyn Jr. and Ann Cryle Esselstyn. Thanks so much for listening.